Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. I hope you enjoy. The Witching Hour, written by Communist Red. It was a lazy, late summer afternoon, and the lingering heat was enough to make Brigadier General Wilkes sweat as he pressed himself into his uniform. Technically, he was off duty at the moment and didn't need to be in the formal uniform, but in frontier towns like the one he commanded, things could go very wrong very quickly. Wilkes made sure to walk the length of the palisade wall every morning and every evening as a result, and it wouldn't do to have his men see him out of uniform. So he sighed, buckling his saber before mumbling a goodbye to his wife and heading out the door. The short walk to the main gates was pleasant and uneventful. The general whistled along merrily to himself despite the heat. Halfway up the stairs to the parapet, however, he stopped. None of the usual easy chatter or whispers from the lookouts reached his ears. At the top, the guards were standing in watchful tension, staring along the road to the west so resolutely that they hadn't noticed his arrival. "What's going on here, Lieutenant?" Wilkes called to the officer in charge, who started and began a guilty salute. "None of that," the general said testily, waving him off. "What's the problem?" "It's a new messenger, sir," replied the lieutenant. "It's getting late, and we've seen no sign of him." "O'Connor, right? Riley O'Connor. This is his third trip." "Aye, sir, the young one. It's possible they had to stay the night at Liston." "Possible, but unlikely. You shouldn't have sent for me." O'Connor should only be making a routine trip, taking news to the nearest hub city and bringing orders and information back to the central city. It was more likely that he'd been waylaid on the journey, or simply became too complacent and was dawdling on his way back. Wilkes considered his options. "What about the forest? Have you seen any motion in there?" he asked, putting out his binoculars. "Aye, sir. They're riled up all right. Couldn't make out what kind, though I thought I saw a boggle or two. They can count well enough to know we're missing a boy, and they can sense our nerves." "He's right there," thought the general, sweeping his gaze across the dark forest on top of the nearby hill. It seemed to be alive with shifting shadows of various shapes and sizes. It was more than a couple of boggles too. His nose twitched, and there was a chill along his neck. The air reeked of foul magic. It looked like the whole damned forest had come out. There was no use sending men to search for O'Connor like this. They'd be set upon by 100 Fae the second they rounded the hill. It was up to O'Connor to make his way back down to the town. In the meantime, though, "Get me Major Fletcher," Wilkes ordered the lieutenant. "Have him call out the guard and the militia on duty, along with Perkins, Bordeaux, and Gordon. Any priest you can get a hold of, too." In truth, the general didn't know what his plan was, or if this kind of force would be needed, but he wasn't going to get caught unprepared. The creatures in the forest were agitated enough that they might mount an attack or whether O'Connor showed up or not. If he did, he would either tear him into pieces in view of the fortified town or charge any rescue force that Wilkes led out. "Bad news all around," he grunted, then joined the others on the wall and steadfastly staring along the road. His only hope was that the sun would stay up long enough to keep any vampires or shades out of the fight. But the minutes ticked by. Soldiers filled into the yard, and the road remained empty. "Where the hell is O'Connor?" In his defense, Riley O'Connor had started a homeward trip enthusiastically. He carried several satchels filled with news and orders and letters. Everything that Central had deemed relevant to their town, in the mass of information they dealt with, had been sent to the hub city, Liston, for him to take back. The frontier town messengers, including him of course, had returned the favor with this week's reports and any notable or usable data from their town, which would go back to Central for compiling and distribution. A month ago, the frontier towns had unexpectedly come into contact with a frontier town of a completely different central city. Information, technology, and resources were being traded between two nations as quickly as possible, and for the last few weeks the messengers had been heavily burdened with the resulting papers. Today had been no different, and Riley's enthusiasm hadn't lasted long in the heat while carrying the heavy satchels. As long as I'm home before nightfall, he figured, Everything will be fine. Only when he stepped into the cool shadow of the hill near the town, the sun was setting behind it, did he realize the danger he was in. He needed to run, and run hard, back to the town. Even then, the guard might not open the gate. He knew they wouldn't risk the town for one messenger. As he readied himself to run, he felt an alien urge, not his own, upon him. A compulsion to walk up the hill and enter the dark forest that topped it. He shivered in anticipation, will against will, before fear woke him and he sprinted for the gate. It was too late, he knew. Already he could feel them grasping at him, and he screamed and beat at their hands with the cloth end. Steel? Still, lad, hold still. Damn it, Connor, calm yourself. It's us, you young fool, shouted the lieutenant, desperately trying to hold on to him. The group of soldiers with him were shifting uneasily, but to Riley, they might have been angels. They began to march briskly back to the gate, where 3 wide ranks of soldiers were lining up against the wall. They met Brigadier General Wilkes and Major Fletcher on the left wing. "So here's the boy, the general said gruffly. "No harm done. Fortunate lad, very fortunate. We'll look after you now, but you'll have to look after yourself a little too. I should think, Major, pass the boy to one of the spare pistols and a bayonet, will you? You'll have to use that as a knife in a pinch. Take him to the back row. He's safest there." The second the boy had appeared on the location, Wilkes knew they had 2 options. He could man the walls, leave the gate closed, and watch as the boy was gutted by whichever fey creatures got to him first. Probably a werewolf, resulting in the loss of the messengers and the important new information from Central. His men's morale would drop, and he'd have to train up yet another young messenger. But casualties would be at a minimum. Alternatively, he could march out to meet the threat, but he knew that he would certainly lose some of his men, at the least. More critically, whenever the gates were opened in view of the host on the hill, there was a chance of them flooding in and losing every man, woman, and child in the town. Once outside, they could not return until the threat was seen off, but there was one more important consideration. Brigadier General Wilkes was really fucking sick of watching children die. So now he stood with 3 ranks of fine men, young and old, boisterous and fearful, each one armed against the shadows. Around them, priests were chanting, holding torches and bowls of holy water. They scratched runes and wards into the earth around the lines of red-coated men. The repellent and dissuasion symbols were not as strong as the banishing runes carved into the palisade walls, but they would give pause to the smaller fae, particularly the less corporeal ones. Father Peter had merged some of the newly discovered runes with some obscure older ones, claiming that their cumulative effects would be revolutionary, and was even now carving them carefully and far too excitedly into the road. The sun was nearly down, the shadow of the hill edging up towards them. Already some creatures would be darting from the safety of the forest, although the lingering sun could still burn or dissipate the more sensitive majority. "All ranks, make ready!" called Major Fletcher, then more quietly to the general. "Ammo?" "Load silver!" called Wilkes. The silver shot was more expensive than the lead shot, and they wouldn't get their next shipment for 2 weeks. But there was no point loading lead if they were facing werewolves first, and the werewolves always came first. As if on cue, several werewolves burst from the foliage and bound down the hill. "Wolves!" cried Wilkes, but all he thought was predictable. The werewolves had always acted as shock troops, relying on their speed, size, and ferocity to break through. These hadn't even waited for the sun to go down fully in an attempt to catch him off guard. In reality, this was a mistake, as the bulk of the Fae were left behind, too slow or sun-sensitive to assist. And a lone wolf, no matter how powerful, would always go down under a pound of silver. "Hold! On my mark!" The lead werewolf topped the small rise. "First rank! Fire!" A rolling crack of thunder. "Down! Reload! Second rank! Fire! Down! Reload! Third rank! Fire! Down! Reload! First rank! Fire! Down! Reload! Fire at will! Several wolves had gone down in second and third volley. Only one had managed to reach the front rank before being cut down, and the rest had fled back towards the hill with silver bullets in their tail. There was no time to relax. The sun was well and truly set now, and all manner of fey creatures began to seethe down the hill. Little goblins, boggles and bogarts, a couple of trolls and a few shades, flanked by gnolls and great spiders. Fairies and wraiths flitted above them. Wilkes thought he saw a banshee, while thick, ugly witches and hags began to prepare spells to cast from behind the mess. "Load, lad," was all Major Fletcher said, though he gave this general a pained look. "Hold! On my mark! First rank! Fire!" And the military machine sprang to life, firing volley after roiding rifle fire without ceasing. Dozens of fey creatures fell, screeching and setting Wilkes on edge, but it couldn't stem the tide. "Fireballs! Take cover!" someone screamed. Several witches' spells bubbled and flared in colored spears towards the line. Some of the men flinched or ducked, but the deadly orbs didn't harm a single man. Some of them had deflected, exploding into thick, burning goo on the other fey. Others seemed to have an energy sucked from them and into Peter's strange carvings. They rolled flickering into men's feet, where they glutted and died. The priests roared in triumph, waving flaming torches and holy water. It was their job to keep the spiritual beings at bay. The rest of the swarm hesitated at the line of wards and ruins, before pushing, or being pushed, past them and onto the first rank, who were waiting with bayonets fixed. The line quickly devolved into a bloody hand-to-claw combat, for the second and third ranks supported the best they could. Major Fletcher narrowly avoided being disemboweled by one of the remaining werewolves, before forcing his silver saber through the beast's chest. From the parapets above, Perkins' sharpshooter squad fired over their comrade's head to hit high-priority targets. One of them swore suddenly. "Vampires, sir! Bayonets!" he called, and Wilkes saw several shadowy bat shapes fluttering towards them from the hill. Several of them bulged and transfigured suddenly into pale humanoid figures, landing with screeches and thumps around and even inside the now thinned ranks. At the same time, the witches had begun to hurl hexes high into the air, so that they landed amongst the men, exploding into colorful but painful globs of energy. The lines began to fall into disorder. But some made ready in time. Their bayonets, hardwood reinforced with iron, swept forward. One by one, the vampires were pinned and staked through their heart. O'Connor slashed viciously with his bayonet knife, forced one back onto the waiting point of a comrade's bayonet. The remaining shifted back and fled. Perkins's sharpshooters took out several of the witches, who had come closer to lob their spells against the men and force the breast back. For a second, there was a lull. Werewolves slain, vampires fleeing, and witches useless. The horde looked for guidance and direction and saw only a line of death in front of them. The more aggressive pushed forward, thirsty for human blood. Others began to creep back, looking to cower in safety, mindful of the fey corpses that they stood amongst. For their part, Wilkes's men were possibly in poor shape. His front line was decimated. The remains of the other two looked shocked and twitchy after fighting off the vampires and witches. Priests bustled about the wounded, ensuring there were no fatal or transformative wounds, but Wilkes saw the fear in his enemy and wondered at it. The hate and the fear and the anger he felt was nothing new. He had known it all his life, locked in a wooden cage of a town while nightmares owned the outside world. But now, 1,000 years of technology and rituals passed around by humanity, and with these men at his back, he felt something new. He felt a fiery drive of a man, of a species that should be free, against the filth that riddled his land and that stood against him now. "Fix bayonets!" Wilkes called. The major looked at him, concerned. "Sir, he began, but the men were attaching bayonets to their rifles as if they were parade day. He saw one man take the bayonet from a wounded man beside him. He must have lost his own. They stood at attention, iron-rimmed bayonets gleaming in the firelight. 2 ranks, he called then. Forward, march! The men stared at him, some near tears, some with the same fire he felt, but they marched. God bless them! They marched in 2 straight lines, away from the safety of the walls and into the darkness. Wilkes raised his saber and marched with them. For the rest of his life, he could never say whether some arsehole had brought a drum and began to beat time, or if it was just blood pumping through his head. But each man marched in perfect step, 1, 2, 1, 2, towards the bewildered and hideous mass that faced them. Some of the braver fey creatures growled and came towards them, but as a slash and a stab, 1, 2, 1, 2, and they were down, the lines never missing a beat. A man fell to a new foe or an old wound. Wilkes couldn't tell. But he was replaced instantly by a member of the 2nd rank. The fey creatures before themselves paused, then drew themselves up. Then they fled from the prey they fought back, fled from the line of men in perfect sync, fled from the stabbing blades and the brightness of the torches. The nightmares fled in fear. Charge! Wilkes had screamed, but the men were already charging, paying back an ancient enemy with all the hate and anger they and their ancestors had ever suffered. As if from a distance, Wilkes saw himself amongst the madness, cutting down leering creatures in a frenzy. When he came to himself, he stood on the edge of the forest with 2 ranks reformed. It stunk of magic. The air was thick and oppressive. It had always taunted him from a distance, daring him to step into it and never be seen again. Now, though, he could sense the tang of fear deep inside the silent woods, and he almost dared to step into the challenge of the Fey back. Not me, he thought. They are still too strong, and we are too weak. But my son, or perhaps my grandson, maybe they will walk in without fear. He held out his hand to Father Peter, who handed him his flaming torch. The general swept it through the undergrowth of the forest's entry, and the flames flickered and spread. They would not live long, he knew, in the air so thick with magic. This is a symbol of what will come, he said to himself, and to the men arraying behind him, and to the forest. Then he paused, waiting for a response that would not come, turned, and marched these 2 lines back down the hill. The living walked or were dragged into a space between the inner and outer gates, where they could be checked for concealed shapeshifters or transformative wounds. A single Fey or thrall in the town could mean destruction. While the priest sprayed them with holy water and prayed over them, Major Fletcher called out the names of the dead, whose bodies had been left outside the gates for retrieval tomorrow. Ensign Bligh, Ensign Cadwell, Lieutenant Cork, Ensign Davies, Corporal Dusk, Ensign Edwards. The list droned on, and Wilkes tried to shut it out. If he had just kept them in the town, those men would still be alive. But he saw O'Connor, shell-shocked and bloody, but alive, and shook his head softly. Each man had sworn to give his life to others. O'Connor's survival was a testament to that oath, and the information he carried was the reward, the victory. More bitter as it was certainly their victory, was a result of years of knowledge, passed along like a weapon, until he could strike. Every man, woman, and child in this town would give their life to pass the torch on to the next, just a little bit brighter each time, until the darkness could no longer stand, and humanity was rightful owner of the land that was theirs to explore. That's what it meant to be human. That was why they had won. He just had to carry the torch a little while longer. End of story. I would quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and Patreons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barky, Lord Azrakal, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Dragzoon WRE, Holly's Sister, Arcadian. Thank you very much.